Welcome viewers, you're watching this special presentation of Sansad TV with your host Kriti Mishra, and joining us right now is a very special guest, Vice Chairman of NITI Aayog, Mr. Suman. Sir, welcome to Sansad TV and thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Sir, thanks a lot. So talking about India's economic growth, over the past decade it has been phenomenal, stupendous, from 10th largest economy to 5th largest economy, and probably we are heading towards being the 3rd largest economy. Talking about the budget, sir, how do you think it will prove to be a catalyst in our economic progress going ahead?
Well, I'm very glad that you started with India's economic growth because I think that people in India and outside India don't appreciate how sustained India's growth already has been. This is not a reason for complacency, but it's a reason for believing that this could be and should be India's takeoff moment, irrespective of what's happening in the rest of the world. Okay? I won't bore you and the audience with numbers, but the United States grows at about 2%. We have maintained 6% growth for almost 3 decades on average. And countries like China grew at 8 to 10% on their path to becoming developed economies. Now your question is obviously about the budget which has been presented today, and I think because NITI Aayog is not particularly about tax rates and all of that, it's about thinking long term. That's certainly my interest. What I wanted to say is that Honorable PM has described this as our Amrit Kal. And he has many reasons for doing it, but what I find is aligned with the concept of Amrit Kal is that this is the era of India's so-called demographic dividend. India, given that we are the most populous country, this is important on a global scale, not just on a domestic scale, but I'll talk about the domestic because that's what the budget was largely about. Okay, so we want to maintain fast growth. What the Prime Minister has said on many occasions is that you can't get there on the basis of business as usual. And I think that people sometimes misunderstand the nature of our employment challenge. And certainly, the opposition talks of jobless growth, unemployment, all the numbers that are coming out of government, out of the official agencies, government agencies, suggest that's not been the case. There has been healthy employment, there's been healthy employment in agriculture, there has been healthy employment even in manufacturing. However, what our youth in particular want is better jobs, higher paying jobs. And the only way of getting higher paying jobs is to increase what economists call productivity. Okay? And so I see the core of this budget as, or the, if you like, the integrating dimension of this budget is how do we get on a productivity bandwagon given our demographic dividend. So if that's the problem, the question is what are the proposals, what are the solutions? And I think the way to structure it is partly to think of the supply of workers, supply of labor, and then how to increase the demand. And that's addressed on, both sides are addressed in the budget. But what is most visible, because it's novel, it's new, it's bold, it's courageous, is what is proposed on the supply of labor. Now, I talked about productivity. I have to introduce another technical term, which is that economists talk of employment in the informal sector and employment in the formal sector. What we know is that it is formal sector employment which has been stuttering, as it were, and yet we also know that the way to raise productivity is on the job, in contract, informal contract, because that's how employers invest in their labor force. So I want, your audience to appreciate that what this budget is attempting to do is kickstart the transition of first-time employees into the formal sector, but they can't do that given their existing skill levels, and they can't, and you would have, I saw the story in the newspapers that Larsen and Toubro said that they had jobs for 45,000 engineers that they could not fill. Meanwhile, you've got people queuing up for government jobs. So, these problems were not created in a day, Kriti. They won't be solved in a day. But I would say that this budget is breaking new grounds to try and propel us against a strong economy into a new space. And that new space is largely about first-time employment, but also women. We're talking about getting women into the labor force through creches, through partnerships with the private sector. So this is about getting India's labor force, as it's growing, into higher productivity, formal employment. Okay, you can prepare people, but that's no point if there are no jobs. And so I think the budget has a number of proposals to also improve what I might call the demand side. A lot of this, one of the things that one gets out of the research is that Indian firms have up till now been very shy of taking on labor. Now people say it was because labor laws, labor codes, whatever, and as you know, this government earlier has put out model codes, but it's up to the individual states to implement them, but that will probably happen. So they've done stuff on the legislative side, but they are providing all kinds of incentives for what economists call labor-intensive employment to the firms. If I could just draw an analogy with something NITI Aayog was associated with, which is the product-linked incentive schemes. Okay, now that was a gamble. The gamble was that we weren't getting what we wanted through business as usual. Putting in, as it were, performance-linked subsidies was a way of advertising that you were serious. And as you know, the most successful of those has been in mobiles, which has attracted Apple here. So I would conceptually say that what this budget is trying to do is give the same kickstart to, as it were, the shift of labor from the informal sector to formal employment, and in a sense persuade our private sector, not just corporate, also MSMEs, that it is in their interest to hire the labor that is now on the market because it's got better skills.
Well, absolutely, sir. And since we were talking about competitive economic growth rates, sir, the downside risk to our growth, of course, is in the global context. There are global headwinds, there are global uncertainties. How hedged are we against these, and how will our budget further pave way for greater economic growth?
I think our biggest hedge is our scale. And, I don't, firstly, as you rightly said at the beginning of the interview, we are poised to be the third largest economy. But that's not the only point. The point is that while I am a great believer in the need to be globally competitive, the fact of the matter is that we are the process of internal integration, Kriti, is still incomplete. Okay? So the reason we went for GST, the reason we are putting in all this infrastructure, transport infrastructure, railways, highways, etc., is so that we can become a more integrated labor and goods market. And, the fundamentals of economics are that there are two important drivers of economic growth. One is technology, which, can be good for you, bad for you. The other is what economists call the gains from trade, specialization. And so India still has a lot of bandwidth or space by integrating the domestic market. And I think that is our more important hedge, which is that our scale. Now, linked up to that, though, is a challenge, and that challenge is that as we become, even if we remain, as open to trade, no more than today, when we are twice the size of our present economy, we will be occupying a larger part of global trade, global investment. We are already a large part of global labor flows, and people will then want reciprocal action. They will say, you want access to us, you want your people to come to us, etc. You open up as well. I don't think that that's terrible, but I think we have to be sure we go down the path of remaining competitiveness even while catering to the domestic market.
Point well taken, sir. A very pertinent point mentioned by you, but you talked about investment. Sir, angel tax was considered a pet noir of startups. Sir, after abolishing angel tax, what kind of impact do you foresee on our startup ecosystem particularly, and of course our other sectors open for investment?
Look, I think this is as much about substance and as signaling. I mean, the angel tax has been controversial since it was introduced. I think both in finance and in startups, the signal that is sought to be sent is that don't flee to Singapore, don't flee to Dubai. We are committed to, as it were, making this a more congenial environment for startups. Now, it is the case that lifestyle-wise, you may prefer to be in Singapore, you may prefer to be in Dubai, but people are, in any case, repatriating for all kinds of reasons, emotional reasons, and all of that. I would also say that, in some ways, the tax system can also be something of a discouragement or a deterrent. And I'm very pleased that the commitment has been made to do a full review of our direct tax code, because I think what this budget says very clearly is it is the private sector that will generate jobs. It is the private sector that will generate productivity. We need to encourage the private sector. There are many things the private sector could be doing more of, and research and development is one of those. But that the old attitude of the MyBAP government, that it's the government's role to provide jobs, the government's role to provide, if you like, risk protection. I think we are now affluent enough that we should equip people with safety nets like the health insurance scheme and even the food rations, etc. Equip people to make their own choices. But I would say, going back to my theme about integrating the market, that it is very important for us to have a vibrant employment market, because I think one of the very damaging, potentially damaging moves for our aspiration to fast growth is if states start to say that employment here is only for, those who are born or who adopt well and who speak our language, etc. That fragmentation of India would be disastrous, and I'm sure that the Supreme Court will protect us, but what will protect us most is an extremely vibrant job scene or employment scene. And I think it is that recognition in Prime Minister Modi's third term that really makes this an important historic moment.
Well, absolutely, sir. And before I wrap up this conversation, while there were tax incentives, there were fiscal incentives. The fiscal target was lowered to 4.9%. Clearly, fiscal prudence for this government is non-negotiable. Your closing thoughts on that?
It's all consistent with the underlying strategy. You want the private sector to play a bigger role, even in nuclear power, which was the holy cow up till now, that was announced. So then you've got to give them the financing means to do so. You can't do that if the government is sucking up all the savings in the economy. And so the only way, there's also a question of, having more money, paying less in interest and all of that. But fundamentally, if you want the private sector to invest more, then the government has to borrow less. And you can only do that and also another important way in which this can generate dividends is that if there's credibility, and I think there is, it could improve our credit rating, and then that helps the private sector enormously as well. Yeah.
Absolutely, sir. What a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective with Sansad TV.
Okay, fine. Good. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
With camera person D.K. Pandey and camera assistant Sandeep, I'm Kruti Mishra signing off for Sansad Television.